All right, we're not going to waste any time. We will get right to it here on a Wednesday on Query and Company. Jake Query, Jimmy Cook, Eddie Garrison here as well. I assume most of you know this by now because this just came out about 30 minutes ago or so out at West 56th Street at the Colts Complex. Shane Steichen meeting with the media, and he announced this change in terms of the personnel for Sunday's matchup between the Colts and the New York Jets.
I want to address, Anthony's situation. I've said the process for a long time. And what I mean by that, it's the attention to detail in everything he does, from the classrooms to the walkthroughs to practice to the weight room, all those little things, right? It just got to be at a higher standard. And that's what was talked about, and that's where we went with it. And so that was discussed with him 2 weeks ago. And those are the conversations that took place. And over the last 2 weeks, he's made strides in those areas, big-time strides, becoming a pro's pro. And is he a finished product? No, he's not. And it's my job to help him get there along with the rest of the coaching staff. But he's a hell of a talent. Like I said, we've never lost faith or belief in him and his abilities. And he's shown strides. He really has. And with that being said, he will be our starter again. He's going to start this week. He's going to start the rest of the season. All right, and we're going to go from there. And I informed Joe of the decision yesterday. He's the ultimate pro. He respects the decision, understands it. I talked to the team this morning about it as well. I informed them of the decision. And look, everyone has a different journey, right? Everyone has a different way, development and how you go about the process, and everyone wants instant gratification right now. And sometimes it doesn't work like that. And you fight through these times. And I love Anthony. He's a great person. Got great faith in him and his abilities to be our franchise quarterback.
Okay, so that means that for the last 2 weeks, Anthony Richardson spent his time doing exactly this. Getting it cleaned up. Now, here's the thing, kidding aside. I understand the reality of what I'm about to say, and that is this. We in the media, you, the fans of the Colts, you, the season ticket holders, are never going to be pleased, it would seem. Because forever we were saying, like, this is ridiculous. Why are you putting Joe Flacco out there? If he gives you the best chance to win games, then what does that say about Anthony Richardson? Have they punted on the season? Have they put Flacco out there until they realize that they were out of contention, and then they'll put Richardson in so that he can grow without the pressures of trying to get to the playoffs? And now Richardson's back in, and there are those that are going to say, this is ridiculous. Why are they putting him out there? They need to win games, and he hasn't played well. They're yo-yoing with him. I get it. I get the hypocrisies or the inconsistencies in terms of reaction. But part of that reaction in terms of the inconsistencies is because the actions themselves seemingly have never taken root. For Anthony Richardson's sake, I'm happy that he is going to get the opportunity. Is he going to play well? I don't know. I will say what we've said all along, and that is that the precedent is that when a quarterback who has the keys handed to him, then has the keys taken away, usually it's over in terms of the relationship between that quarterback and the franchise. Not on a getting along standpoint, but just on a cohesiveness on field standpoint. Now, there are a million ways that we can slice this onion. But I will, my initial reaction is this, and I'm certainly open to the discussion of this being incorrect. But my initial reaction is this. 2 weeks is not a trend. 2 weeks is not a pattern. When you are in high school, there's a reason why the semester is broken down into 9-week periods. When you go into an NFL locker room, there's a reason why the schedule is broken down into 4-week increments. When you work for a business and they talk about the finances of the business, there's a reason why they talk about it in quarters. 2 weeks is not enough time to determine whether or not a player has turned the corner in the right direction or, for that matter, gone in the wrong direction. If if they are evaluating and making changes and yo-yoing around quite frankly, a franchise in general, but a locker room based on what they've seen for 2 weeks, that is way premature in making that kind of a decision, which leads me to believe, that's not to say that Shane Steichen's a fool. What I'm saying is, and it's kind of irrelevant in the grand scheme, but it does make you think that there was something more than simply, maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe Shane Steichen's being honest, and this is just about making sure that Anthony Richardson knew that 7 o'clock means 6, or that an hour of film means 2. But the reality is that 2 weeks, if you're looking at it and you go, look, over the last 2 weeks, he's been great. Okay. I mean, that is not enough to know that something has permanently taken a change, which leads me to believe that you can't rule out the possibility that simply it was a 2-game suspension or slap on the wrist for the tap out and then having the honesty of, look, I was tired, that's why I took myself out of the game. Or there was some sort of a physical ailment that was ailing Anthony Richardson, and for the sake of the scrutiny and everything else of Anthony Richardson, even though I realize by NFL rules they're supposed to be transparent, I don't think you can rule out that something did happen and they thought, you know what, we got to rest him a little bit and whatever else. That would seem to be extreme. Bottom line is Anthony Richardson is back as quarterback. He is going to start for the Colts. Theoretically, Jimmy, that means he is going to start for the rest of the year. I would imagine that for Colts fans, they would be relieved by that because you want to see the guy that is supposed to be your future. You want to see what you get out of him. We were all pining that we needed to see more. They pulled the plug too early. Now he's back inserted in. Again, I don't want to be overly picky here. It does look wildly inconsistent, and I think the vast majority of people probably are going, what in the world are we doing here? Make a decision and stick with it.
This is what I asked for yesterday, realizing the ramifications that would happen, which is that it looks incompetent, it looks rushed, it looks like they're a chicken with their head cut off running around trying to figure out what the heck's going on. But rationally, it puts you back on course for what this season should be. You take the heat in this moment right now, and you give whatever weak sauce reasoning you wanted to in press conference today for why Anthony Richardson has learned from Joe Flacco or learned to be a better quarterback the last 2 weeks. Do I buy that? No, Jake, you're exactly right. You don't suddenly fix patterns in 2 weeks, but you take that initial blow from the media, from fans, from whoever who think you don't know what you're doing to save face long-term in the season is back on for what they wanted this year. I'm not saying they're suddenly going to be a playoff team. You look by any metric, the offense is pretty much the same, Richardson or Flacco out there, which is more of a damnation on Flacco than it is for what Anthony Richardson could be. But you come out today, you say, hey, Anthony Richardson's a starter again. He's learned a lot. He's grown a lot. And he's a starter the rest of the year. I don't care how it looks optically. Yes, you're taking heat today, but it gets you back to what this season was all about, which is, do they have a franchise quarterback? Or do they have a guy that they whiffed on and changes
Jimmy,
need to be done at the end of the year?
From the beginning, what did we say? This year was about the development of Anthony Richardson, right?
Yep.
Above all else, this year was about the development of Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson has spoken in the last couple of minutes. Here's what he had to say.
I feel like there's still room for improvement, all around. But lately I've been working on consistency. That's always been a thing of mine, just trying to perfect that and just get better at that, just being consistent in all aspects. But this week, and the past couple of weeks, I've been trying to focus on sacrifice some more. The guys ask me to do certain things, even if I didn't feel like doing it. You got to do it because you sacrifice and they're doing it, so why not do it?
It was like extra note taking, getting here early, staying what tangible things did you have to kind of go out there and do?
Just showing them that I could do my work, day in and day out consistently. As a pro, you feel like, okay, I'm doing my work, I'm getting it done. That's enough, but it's never enough. Especially not for the vets. They feel like if they got to do the extra work, you got to do it too. So that's how it's supposed to be.
Makes you wonder, truth be told, whether or not, and I don't think this is the case, but I think we have to open up the avenue of all possibilities. The players finally spoke up.
Yeah.
Kenny Moore finally spoke up. Zaire Franklin finally spoke up. Not directly, right? Not directly. But they did seemingly come out and say, look, what are we doing here? We got to start, like, I'm tired of being yo-yoed around. I'm tired of the inconsistencies. I'm not saying that they were directly addressing the quarterback situation, but it is, from a timing standpoint, pretty coincidental that once the locker room started to show and take on water of some form of a mutiny, then all of a sudden the ship was turned in the right direction. Now, Shane Steichen was asked, because this is going to be one of the big questions, and that is, whose decision was this? Was this Jim Irsay, the owner, who we know intervened with Carson Wentz and the decision on whether or not he was going to be the franchise quarterback? Is this Jim Irsay, the owner, who we know came in at the seemingly not even 11th hour, but just kind of out of nowhere and said, you know what, I'm going to bring in Jeff Saturday to kind of give me an inventory, if you will, a look over of my locker room? Was this Jim Irsay who came in and said, let's see what we have in Sam Ehlinger and not Matt Ryan? Or was this Chris Ballard who came and said, look, my fate is attached to Anthony Richardson, and if my head coach determines that Anthony Richardson's not the guy, my owner's going to want to know why I'm the one that took him. And so I, as Chris Ballard, I've got to go, and I'm talking about Chris Ballard who, yes, great, like 27 years ago, Andrew Luck retired on Chris Ballard, and Chris Ballard cashed that IOU check for like 5 years. But the same Chris Ballard that made a good decision, I think, in getting Phillip Rivers and then thought he was going to get a second year and didn't. The same Chris Ballard that went and got Carson Wentz, who was a good player, who showed, and his resume of such was certainly worthy of giving him the opportunity to be your multi-year quarterback, and it didn't work out. And the same Chris Ballard who, and you can actually say kudos to him for waiting until the situation was such that the Colts had a high enough draft pick to take a young player as opposed to trading up in a draft and take a quarterback midway through the first round that is a mid-tier quarterback, but rather getting into the pool, waiting to get into the pool with a franchise-level quarterback, which, if everything worked out, is what Anthony Richardson is believed to be. But is this Chris Ballard, who suddenly is seeing his name now more than anybody else being the one that is the most questioned about his long-term future with the franchise? Was this him strong-arming the coach? Or was it Shane Steichen simply saying, you know what? I'm a young coach. I was handed the reins for the head coaching position in this, my very first time as a head coach, but I've been known as a quarterback whisperer, and I need to be given autonomy in terms of how I interact with, discipline, and grow my quarterback, and this was one of those moves, and trust the process. Trust the process, because this is all part of the process, and I saw when Anthony Richardson sat there and said, I was tired, I'm not going to lie to you, immediately I thought to myself, that is an error in the way that he said that. He should not have answered that question with that sort of transparency to the media. I can appreciate his honesty. I can appreciate his personality. But making the decision to be that honest about that moment shows to me an immaturity at the quarterback position in terms of leadership, because the rest of the locker room themselves came out and said, I can't believe he said that. Ryan Kelly was surprised. Zaire Franklin was surprised. So did Chris Ballard then, did Shane Steichen then come out and say, this is an example of a guy where I need to simply pull him aside and say, okay, your decision-making there was questionable. And if you're going to be a franchise quarterback that I'm going to entrust to make calls for me, to make audibles for me, to read defenses for me, we're going to have to reassess where your maturity level is. So which of the three was it? Shane Steichen did answer that question as well.
I talked to Chris, I talked to Jim, I talked to everybody, but ultimately it was my decision.
There you go. Assuming that that's correct. And maybe, just maybe, everybody overthought it, and maybe this was indeed Shane Steichen simply saying, you know what? I have a promising young player who is still at the core a young person, and therefore I had to undergo a time in the timeout chair for him. I had to say to him, you know what? I like a lot of the things you're doing, but we're going to take a quick timeout, and you're going to sit down in the control chair, and you're going to have to witness things, and you're going to have to observe, and you're going to have to learn. Maybe that's what happened.
Regardless of who ultimately made the decision, and again, Shane Steichen's the one that points out there that it is his call. He's the one that made it. I tweeted when this news first broke about a half hour ago that the Colts have finally seen the light. Now, what I was talking about in that regard is not some type of clairvoyance they now have. It is that my fear for the franchise, and I've said this from the moment they benched Richardson for Flacco, you are looking down the barrel at July 2025 with no answers about this team moving forward. And you have to at some point assess if Flacco was legitimately an improvement offensively to the point that it significantly increased your playoff chances. And I don't care if 2 games, some might say, is not enough of a sample size. You have 2 games combined with an entire body of work of Joe Flacco's career and what it is. And at the end of the day, it wasn't going to be enough to justify robbing yourself of clear answers you need by the time you go into next offseason. So I'm not giving the Colts a pass. I still have my frustrations with Chris Ballard. This optically is still a mess for them in pretty much every area, but Flacco was not going to put you in the place you wanted to be for this short-term window. And so rather than stand idly by, stand by the mistake they made by benching Richardson in the first place, unless it was just purely discipline, then whatever. But it was a mistake based on long-term aspirations. I admire, and maybe I'm giving too much a pass here, Jake, you tell me, I do admire the ability to maybe not outwardly say you were wrong, but adjacently say you were wrong by making this change now so that regardless of what happens, and they can say, Steichen said later in the press conference, well, we're still trying to win now while developing Anthony Richardson. Both are on the table. They're focused on still making the playoffs, and that's great. You can still do that, but you need answers with Anthony Richardson. And you've pointed out in the past, maybe they won't all come this season, but they can't be 10 starts, and that's it. That's your ball game. Okay, we have enough on this guy. It's over. Like Caleb Williams has 10 starts to his name right now. The Bears are still trying to figure out if it's an offensive line problem or if there's developmental problems there. And this is a rookie season for him. This is year 2, albeit injury-marred, for Anthony Richardson. So I'm not going to sit here and say that the Colts now are in good graces or the fan base should be fully forgiving of them. But they've gotten back to what this year was supposed to be about, which is Anthony Richardson. He is supposed to be a franchise quarterback. He needs reps to learn and grow. And if by season's end, you're dissatisfied with it, and if there's one thing we know about Jim Irsay, he's not afraid to take aggressive action when he feels he needs to intervene. If you feel like in the remaining games of this season, there is a verdict on Anthony Richardson, and you can clearly say whether or not he was the franchise or not, then you act accordingly. You change front office, you maybe change head coach, and you go back to square one. But the idea of being back into this purgatory of 8-9 and just missing the playoffs and a Band-Aid veteran quarterback being the same old song and dance you've trotted out here for 5 years was unacceptable. And I am happy that they made the change now, because what did I tell you yesterday? If they would have done this in 2 weeks when the schedule gets softer and weaker and it goes back to your thoughts of maybe they were coddling Richardson, it would have really ticked me off. But the fact you're doing this now where there's still 2 meaningful competition games because the Jets still have a solid defense and that's a competitive AFC playoff hunt game based on where you are, and the Lions are still upcoming, you're no longer just saying, oh, we didn't trust him against the toughness of this schedule. No, you're throwing the keys back to him and saying, this is what the season was about to begin with. Regardless of the optics of how it looks short term, the rest of the season now is about his development, and that's what it was from day one. That's where I'm at with it. Like, I'm very happy with the fact that they've done this about face. Even if in the short term it looks bad optically, you're back on track for what the season was supposed to be. And if you walk into the playoffs because of it, great. But I told you how bleak the playoff odds are right now. Weren't improving with Joe Flacco. You need to get back to what mission 1 was this year, which is what is Anthony Richardson and where can we evaluate him over the final couple games of the season with better answers for April and better answers for July 2025, because no answers at quarterback and a 10-start third-year quarterback at that point would have been unacceptable.
Yeah, I'm curious of this as well. This has been brought up. I don't think it's the case. I certainly hope it's not the case, right? People have asked me, they're like, hey, is it possible that this is because of like all the season ticket renewals, the fan upheaval, all of those things? Is it possible that that's what has led to, them saying, you know what, enough's enough. Like, let's just go ahead and let people know that this is where we stand. Now, going back to, I think we can run this through the Elixir with what Anthony Richardson has learned,
Okay.
right?
Yeah. You make the payment on that?
Do you have the Elixir ready? Did we dust that off, Eddie, by chance? Did we get that out of the closet?
I've got to go find it. I put it away after its one-time use because you told me that it takes up a lot of our budget.
While he looks for that, quick question for you, because another comment I've seen on Twitter. If you had to pick one, is this more the growth that Anthony Richardson really had over 2 weeks? Or is it more how bad Flacco looked over 2 weeks? Because if Flacco doesn't have the struggles that he has,
Jimmy,
I don't think we're having this conversation.
personally that 2 weeks,
Right.
I know I'm a cynic.
No, I don't either.
I don't think that something dramatically changed in 2 weeks because I don't think 2 weeks is long enough to make the determination that something has been changed from anomaly to pattern. I just don't.
I think it has to do in large part with how bad Flacco looked. Because you tried to sell this as win now, and the veteran court, you thought you were getting the Flacco that showed up in Cleveland before the playoffs. And instead you got the Flacco that's largely been his NFL self for the last decade.
Okay, let's see. Anthony Richardson, in terms of what he's learned in the last 2 weeks, I'd like to run this through the Elixir. For those that aren't familiar with it, the way the Elixir works, and somebody asked to run it, it's a great, and that's what I love about our listeners, right? The understanding. They said, Jake, just run it through the Elixir and find out, and that's a great way of doing it. So the Elixir is a program that I bought. It's a computer where you take an athlete quote, you run it through, it deciphers, then it tells you what the athlete is really trying to say, right? What the athlete's really trying to say. So Anthony Richardson talking about just the last couple of weeks, here's what he had to say.
I feel like there's still room for improvement, all around. But lately I've been working on consistency. That's always been a thing of mine, just trying to perfect that and just get better at that, just being consistent in all aspects. But just this week and the past couple of weeks, I've been trying to focus on, sacrifice some more. The guys ask me to do certain things, even if I didn't feel like doing it, you got to do it because he's sacrificing, they're doing it, so why not do it?
It was like extra note-taking, getting here early, staying what, tangible things did you have to kind of go out there and do?
Just showing them that I could do my work, day in and day out consistently. As a pro, you feel like, okay, I'm doing my work, I'm getting it done. That's enough, but it's never enough. Especially not for the vets. They feel like if they got to do the extra work, you got to do it too. So that's how it's supposed to be.
Okay, go ahead and hit the button and run it through the Elixir for interpretation, Eddie. Seems to be taking a minute. Oh, okay, so it's done, right? And here's what it tells us that Anthony Richardson was really saying.
I am totally refreshed, not tired anymore, and I'm never going to be tired again. I would like to tell you more, but I have to go watch film, which I do every morning at 6 a.m.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Totally clean, right? Plenty about this over the course of today. With Anthony Richardson back now as the starter, one would assume that means that is a permanent change. It will be a major theme over the course of this show today, but also college football side of things. Yesterday, a lot of people think Indiana's getting snubbed a little bit. I think actually Indiana's getting a lot of love from a national standpoint. College football playoff rankings are out. I think Indiana now, barring total disaster in Columbus, is in when it comes to the playoffs. But one of the guys that can shed better light on that from an outside perspective, Adam Rittenberg, ESPN college football senior writer, joins us next. Last night, the college football playoff rankings were announced for this week 12, and I thought it was interesting. I know from an Indiana fan standpoint, there were a lot of people that felt like Indiana has been slighted. I don't think you can say that anymore, because if you look at the undefeateds, they obviously, even though Indiana has yet to have on their resume a win over a ranked team, they are still the highest rank of the undefeateds remaining. Well, Oregon obviously is at number one, but Oregon has a win over Ohio State. Of those out there between Army, BYU, Indiana coming in the 5th spot. Now, it gets a little bit confusing in terms of matchups, and that's all fairly irrelevant because there is so much left to do. But to talk about all of it, break it down a little bit, he is the senior college football writer for ESPN, Adam Rittenberg, joining us on the Express Pro Tire and Auto Guest Line. Adam, I will begin right with this question, and that is, do you believe that Indiana now has punched their ticket permanently, and assuming that they beat Purdue, that what happens against Ohio State would be irrelevant in terms of them staying in this college football playoff?
Yeah, it's good to be with you guys. I don't think necessarily, because you saw what happened to Georgia, a team that has one of the best wins in the country this year at Texas, which is the number 3 team in the committee's rankings, a convincing win on the road at Texas. They lose, and I know it's their second game, but they lose their second game in convincing fashion and drop 9 spots all the way to number 12. So Indiana, I don't think, has that luxury. If they get blown out by Ohio State, the way this committee has behaved at times has been confounding in the past, and it wouldn't shock me if they really punished Indiana for that loss. And then we can, well, they finally played a good team and they didn't show up, and they lose by 30. So I do think that the nature of that game is really, really important. Obviously, if Indiana wins, it creates all new possibilities and fulfills all those incredible proclamations that Coach Sig made when he got there. But how they lose and how they compete is also really, really important because of what the committee did this past week to not just Georgia, but a Miami team that, again, has not been as dominant as Indiana, but finally lost a game, and boy, did they pay a price in the rankings.
You know, and I don't know how to word this, Adam. It's going to sound odd, okay? But with Indiana being 5th, what that says to me is that the committee looked at it and said, okay, Indiana has not yet – I mean, I know Michigan is Michigan by brand, right? But Indiana has yet to get a win over – like, they don't have a signature win per se, but it feels to me like the committee has put them as high as they can put a team that doesn't have a signature win, essentially as a tip of the cap of saying it's not lost on us that you are doing everything that's asked of you and doing it fairly convincingly. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say? In other words, I think this is not just Indiana having a favorable schedule, but maximizing what that schedule means for them and the way that they are, for the most part, taking control of games.
Right. No, I think that is a rewarding, and maybe it's a bit of a correction from where they were last week. There was a lot of criticism, mainly for BYU being 9, but even for Indiana being there at 8, given how dominant that they had been. And it would have been interesting if they had been dominant and they built on that first half and blew out Michigan. Would they be 4? Would they be 3? I mean, it would be, you could make a stronger case because Penn State, with one loss to Ohio State, a respectable loss, but they don't have many signature wins or any signature wins either, and they haven't been nearly as dominant as Indiana, needing to come back to beat USC on the road, to beat Wisconsin on the road. So that would be a much more interesting debate, I think, if Indiana had blown out Michigan. You could say, hey, they should be ahead of Penn State, maybe even ahead of Texas.
When you're mapping out the rest of these weeks, and let's say for the sake of argument that Ohio State does beat Indiana, I know Jake asked if they're solidified or not, but when you're looking at why they wouldn't be, because there's other one-loss teams in the mix, and Indiana still has that undefeated badge for the moment until they match up against Ohio State in 2 weeks. Who are those looming teams that you could see usurp them? Is this brand bias if it's like a 2-loss Georgia versus Indiana, or if it's a one-loss team in the SEC that's kind of lingering there? Is it brand bias, or is it a strength of schedule factor that would work against Indiana if they do wind up losing to Ohio State?
Well, right. Well, they're never going to say it's brand bias, but
right.
We've seen it over time. But yeah, it would certainly be part of it, but it would certainly the strength of schedule. So you have this logjam of teams in the SEC right now, and there's not very many of them that are guaranteed to have a third loss. So, Georgia can give Tennessee its second loss, but most likely get through the rest of the season just with 2 losses and one of the toughest schedule strengths in all of college football, plus that road win against Texas, and their only losses have been away from Sanford Stadium. So Georgia would have a real case. Ole Miss is very interesting, guys, because yes, they have 2 losses. Indiana has 0, but now Ole Miss has a signature win over Georgia that Indiana lacks. And another interesting thing is you look at scoring margin, Indiana leading the country. Who's right behind them? It's Ole Miss. So Ole Miss has that game control, that dominant metric that Indiana can tout. And likely will finish the season 10-2. Where how do you compare those 2 teams? So there's some interesting test cases in the SEC. I don't believe every SEC team that has 2 losses at the end of the year will get in. Sorry, Eli Drinkwitz. I don't think Missouri's going to get in. You can continue to. He should tout them. But I think two blowout losses is disqualifying in this system. So I don't think everyone's getting in at 10-2 in the SEC, but there's still all of these possibilities to have this glut of teams that finish 10-2, and then you've got Notre Dame sitting there with 1 loss and a good chance to finish 11-1. It's a win over Army this week or next week rather. That would help their resume at 11-1.
Adam, this is probably and admittedly a conversation for later, but I'm going to bring it up now just because that's what we do on Sports Talk Radio, right? I know that, like, Florida, for example, has given vote of confidence for their coach. I know that Oklahoma has done the same. We always see those things. In your mind, I would think that if a big-time program has a vacancy, that Curt Cignetti is going to be high on everyone's list. Do you believe that he is the long-term coach at Indiana?
Well, part of me certainly hopes so because it's a great story. But Curt is at an age where, if he wants to coach at the very highest level with all the resources, even though Indiana has taken care of him and given him what he needs to succeed this season, but if he wants to be at a Tier 1 program, which, all due respect, Indiana's never going to be that, he's not 40 years old. He's not 50 years old. He's in his early to mid 60s and would need to make that move if he wants to. So it really comes down to, does he want to finish his career at Indiana, or does he want to take a shot at a program where he can consistently compete for a national championship if he feels like he can't do that at Indiana? They've obviously shown that they're on track to do that this year. History shows that that's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to do going forward. So, again, I think if he was a little younger, I would think, okay, he could stay at Indiana maybe longer into the future. But given his age, given where he's at in his career, I know he wants to coach for a while. I think you got to make that move, not necessarily after this year, but in the fairly near future, because you're right. He's absolutely going to be on these lists and be offered gobs of money.
Well, that's the thing,
even
Adam.
though he's obviously getting paid really well right now.
I mean, he's making, I think, 4.5 at Indiana, okay? And I know that Indiana fans are enthusiastic about their ability to up that number. But realistically, a Florida or a Florida State or an Oklahoma, if they are looking, those are schools that would pay into the 10 to 12 range, correct?
Most of them would. And Curt's a really interesting candidate because, yes, he hasn't been a Power 4 coach very long, but he's been a head coach. He's accomplished. He was with Nick Saban. So there's a lot of things that I think could bump that number up other than just the, oh, my God, we have a chance to get Curt Cignetti. We'll pay him whatever he wants. But I think most of those programs that you mentioned, Florida State would maybe be the one that I'd be a little cautious about because financially they're not in the same position as Big Ten and SEC schools. But, could they pay Curt Cignetti close to $10 million? Absolutely.
Adam Rittenberg, ESPN college football senior writer, joining us, Express Pro Tire and Auto Guest Line. Adam, I know it's a busy time. I appreciate the time you carved out. Look forward to talking to you again, especially if Indiana maintains here in the hunt.
It's an awesome story, guys. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Adam Rittenberg joining us on the program. Again, the big story of the day is that of Anthony Richardson back as the starter for the Colts. We'll get back into that. Then Pat Boylan joins us top of the hour, talking little Pacers. Joel A. Erickson, for that matter, at 2 o'clock. Busy day here on a Wednesday on The Fan. It is, again, just before we came on today is when the news came out that Anthony Richardson was going to start the rest of the year for the Colts, health obviously permitting. But it is a direct 180 from essentially not only what the Colts were saying outwardly, but what was being discussed internally, if you really want to know the truth. I mean, there was definitely, and one of the things, I'm just going to keep going back to this. And I want to be very clear. This isn't in any way, shape, or form me saying that I don't want Anthony Richardson to start. I think we had said, look, they've got to, at this point, this year was always about the development of Anthony Richardson. And if they had benched Anthony Richardson after 10 games, never to allow him to come back out, then absolutely Chris Ballard was done, first off. And if Ballard's done, then Shane Steichen's probably thinking, wait a minute, now am I going to get another general manager that comes in, which is one that didn't hire me? We know how that works in most businesses, right? So do we all need to get on the same page here in terms of this direction and make sure that we're not sacrificing too early and making decisions too early? Those are all, I think, factors that have to be considered. But it does feel more like, because 2 weeks is not a trend. It's just not. You don't. If you were when you were a kid in school, or if you were somebody that your parents, when you got in trouble and they were like, look, we've got to, before we let you drive to school again, we've got to see some progress in terms of your maturity. They don't make that decision after 2 weeks. I mean, I realize in the NFL, 2 weeks is a long time, but if Anthony Richardson really did have, if it was simple as he was not staying in meetings long enough, he was not showing up to the building early enough, he was not asking enough questions after meetings or looking at film as often enough, he was not making audibles or making the right call when he would come to the line and see a different defensive look because he wasn't as familiar with what that defensive look was. If it was a matter of all that, you don't turn that around in 2 weeks. You just don't. It's pretty easy to come in. I mean, how many practice days have they had? What do they get together as teams and meetings and everything else? I mean, we're talking, 10 meetings? Then the other side of it is, was in fact, as I know John and Stephen Holder had talked about for a moment, was it that he was dinged up, but they didn't want to say it because there was so much negativity about his availability in terms of a health standpoint? Because what's the best ability? Availability, right? Was that it? I don't know that we'll ever know that, but in order now to simply say Anthony Richardson is our guy moving forward, at the very least what that means is that the Colts came to the light of understanding that they had not given it enough time to make a decision of totality. But the inconsistency of, we're going to pull this guy out, we're going to put this guy back in, we're going to do. Keep in mind, it was, 72 hours ago when Shane Steichen said Joe Flacco was starting against the Jets and he is our starter for until otherwise said.
You noticed that, by the way? In Steichen's comments, I'm not saying it means anything, but we joked about this. The last 2 weeks, there's been for now, or there's
Correct.
been caveats attached to it. You didn't get that today. I'm not saying that means anything,
right,
but you did not get that today. You got it 72 hours ago, to your point.
And it's irrelevant now what was being said or whispered. But what was being said or whispered was that the Colts did not like the approach and the professionalism of Anthony Richardson and were not ready to hand the keys back to him. And somehow, and I'll give him credit, somehow he revamped his image in 2 weeks. I mean,
You think he hired a PR guy?
Honestly. Well, in all honesty, I mean, to be fair to him,
right,
there might not have been that much of an image to revamp. I mean, he's been seemingly a solid citizen and nice guy. It's not like he's a guy that you hear all these terrible things about, right?
Correct.
And
you had guys going to bat for him too, Jake. Like Josh Downs, like everybody's wishing him well. There was not a tone of animosity when he got benched.
But is that part of what I think? I think a lot of it was this. I think it was becoming, simply put, I think it was becoming increasingly difficult for Shane Steichen to be able to walk into that locker room and look at Kenny Moore and look at DeForest Buckner and look at Quentin Nelson and look at Zaire Franklin and look at E.J. Speed and look at the veterans of this team that feel like their window, they are in the middle of it right now. I think it was becoming harder for Shane Steichen to go in, look those guys in the eye, and say, I am doing what is best for the future of this franchise, because they don't know whether or not Richardson's the guy, but at least by going with them, you are under the perception that they are trying to build something. When you were going in and starting 39-year-old Weekend at Bernie's Joe Flacco, and who we already have seen this movie once, we saw what happened. I sat right there a year ago. I sat right there. I remember in District Tap, sitting down, and the Houston Texans and the Cleveland Browns are playing in the playoffs, and Joe Flacco had been this remarkable story, and I saw the wheels come off and the screeching smoke from the brake pads right before my very eyes. And I'm like, yeah, it's over. So I've seen that movie before. So it was becoming seemingly harder and harder for Shane Steichen to go into those guys and say, hey, I'm hoping you didn't see that and that this isn't the sequel, but here's what we're going to do to try to win. Those guys had to be saying to themselves, I ain't doing that. And I think you started seeing players, the locker room was getting away from them. They were losing the locker room. So if you're going to lose the locker room, you might as well lose it by trying to go with what it is that is allowing you to have some face of a plan long term.
Well, and it becomes a misnomer, too, to the locker room itself, and almost a lie in that regard. Like, I'm not saying they intentionally lied to them, but you're right, Jake. When you look at Kenny Moore, DeForest Buckner, veterans on this team, and you tell them, okay, win now is our objective, Joe Flacco is the guy, and then the results are worse than what Anthony Richardson was, it becomes a level of dishonesty where it's like, no, you're not trying to help us win now. You're just trying to do an about face and change where the direction of things was for this season. And to stick with Joe Flacco, when we can discuss all we want where this AFC playoff picture is right now, because as we talked about yesterday, half of the AFC sucks. They're just not good.
Yeah,
There's a lot of bad football teams there. And the Colts are much closer to that vat than they are, say, even the Broncos or the Chargers. And with what's left on the schedule, you would be walking a tightrope of mediocrity that I would argue is worse for the entirety of that locker room. Because not only do you undercut the veterans that thought this was suddenly a win-now mode, you're undercutting guys like Josh Downs, younger players on this team that have seen what this franchise has been from afar the last 4 years with Band-Aid after Band-Aid and wanting consistency for their future. And that's hopefully the path you're back on with Anthony Richardson.
A lot more on it over the course of the show. Joel A. Erickson coming up an hour from now. Up next, Orlando Magic on a 3-game win streak. Jake, why are you telling me about the Orlando Magic? I'm listening to Sports Talk Radio in Indianapolis, Indiana. I don't care about the Orlando Magic except for when I go to Disney World and Harry Potter World. I get it. But the Pacers are there tonight, and Pat Boylan joins us next. for Indiana tonight, taking on Orlando, because I do think the Magic have, even without Paolo Banchero, who continues to be out for Orlando, they just have a lot of length at a multitude of positions. Joining us now on the Express Pro Tire and Auto guest line to talk about that, Pat Boylan, who you hear on the Pacers radio network. And, Pat, I'll begin with this. Let's start with from a health standpoint. Toppin, Nembhard, Nesmith, those are the big three that have missed time. Is there any update or anything you can tell us about any of those three?
I think Toppin is close. He was listed as questionable for tonight's game. It wouldn't shock me if he went. So I think he's the one guy of those three that you're hopefully going to see pretty soon. Unfortunately, the news from Rick Carlisle a couple of days ago on Sunday is that Nesmith is probably sometime in December, and that Nembhard is at least a couple of weeks, which could take him into early December. So I think both of those guys you might not see in November. Hopefully Nembhard maybe by the tail end of it. Toppin's the one that is hopefully soon, perhaps even tonight, and I think important because when you look at the bench unit, it has been severely compromised by all of the injuries because guys have had to go from the healthy guys from the bench and into the starting lineup. And then all of a sudden this bench, which had this historic night, a week ago today and has been a major, major strength for this team, has been pretty gutted. So I think if you get Toppin back, that's at least a step in the right direction there.
Do you believe, Pat, that as of right now with this kind of two-headed monster, the way they've played in the last couple of games of Halliburton and, really the rise and the consistency, the outside shot of Benedict Mathurin, is it safer to say that Halliburton his aggression gets going when Mathurin is hitting outside shots and that frees things up? Or is it that Mathurin's outside shot gets going when Halliburton is more aggressive?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's probably a little bit of both. But I do think there certainly is something to having a guy knocking down the outside shot and then the impact of that on Tyrese Halliburton, the spreading the floor that it does. Buddy Hield had that effect on him for so long. And I think the Pacers are still kind of searching for somebody to do a lot of those things that Hield did. Now, that's not to say it was a mistake to move on from him. They've had a lot of players who are deserving of minutes, and many of them better defensively. But that was the one aspect that Buddy Hield brought that I think you're maybe still searching for a little bit. And as you noted, Mathurin's been terrific around the perimeter. It's been interesting to watch Halliburton because he's had games like the one he had on Sunday and the game in Dallas where he gets to all of his spots on the floor. He's getting to the rim. He's getting to the foul line. He's hitting the mid-range. The three-pointer is falling. The assist numbers are really high. But for whatever reason, that just hasn't come as consistently as he would like or as he has performed in the past. So you get a game like you got on Sunday, and I think there's reasonable hope that starts to get him going a little bit. But that backcourt duo of he and Mathurin on Sunday was obviously brilliant, and you're not going to get back-to-back, 35-point games from those guys night in, night out. But I do think if they can continue to form some chemistry together, that you might be starting to hopefully see one of the backcourts of the future. Nembhard will have a say in that and all of that, but when you can get your backcourt playing at a level anywhere near like they were on Sunday, there's kind of a dynamic that this team, even when Mathurin has been healthy in the previous 2 years and had some nice stretches, it's a dynamic that I'm not sure this team has totally had, at least since Halliburton has come over.
Pat Boylan of the Pacers Radio Network is our guest. He joined us on the Express Pro Tire and Auto guest line. Pat, I know that the seasons change year to year, and you have attrition on rosters, and circumstances changes. Expectations for this franchise wants to go change as well. But when I think back to 2 years ago, when Tyrese Halliburton is battling injuries throughout the majority of the season, and the wheels kind of fell off for where they wanted to go as quick as they wanted to go, it was an Eastern Conference where you couldn't afford to make up much ground. Right now, when you look at where the East is, at least from like seeds 3 to 8 in the playoffs, it's separated by a game, if that. How do the Pacers kind of massage and manage the injuries they're dealing with right now to the point that you're not looking at what it was a couple seasons ago where they lose too much ground and they're having an uphill battle that feels insurmountable to get in the playoffs the rest of the way?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think first and foremost, you look at the Pacers' injury situation, and they are really depleted, but you look around the NBA, and Orlando, a great example of this. They're missing their best player in Banchero, and then they're also missing Wendell Carter Jr. The Pacers seemingly have been hit more by quantity in terms of the number of guys out. They've, knock on wood, been fortunate that guys like Halliburton and Siakam and Mathurin have been healthy early on in the season. So other teams have experienced a lot of stars going down. And, I mean, if you just look around the conference, I mean, Milwaukee's off to a terrible start, and Lillard, I think, is missing a couple of games here, and Butler's been out for Miami, and Banchero for Orlando, and Embiid and Paul George for Philadelphia. So the Pacers are dealing with some real injury challenges, but I can't really remember. It's just kind of anecdotal. I'm sure there are numbers somewhere out that could maybe prove this, but I can't really remember a time when the Eastern Conference and really just the NBA as a whole has had so many key guys out at the same time. And obviously that's a little curious coming in the beginning of the season too, because these seemingly aren't wear and tear injuries. So the Pacers are dealing with a lot, but the reality is most of the Eastern Conference is right now. I mean, Cleveland isn't, Boston isn't, and New York isn't, but just about every other team that you would put in that kind of contender type spot is dealing with a fair amount of it. And, from the Pacers' perspective, I think if the injury situation kind of stands as is for the next few weeks, which is probably no Nesmith and Nembhard, but Toppin gets to come back, I think the key for them, they've got their stars up top, and I think the starting lineup is going to be fine. It's can the bench continue to be the positive factor that sometimes pushes you over the top in games, despite the fact that they're going to be shorthanded. And if that's the case, a lot of weight is going to be on guys like Toppin and TJ McConnell to be able to lift up what's kind of a hampered bench unit at the moment.
Pat, do you feel realistically that the Pacers play better when the Colts are starting Joe Flacco or Anthony Richardson?
I wondered if we were going to get into this because it's very fitting for Pacers conversation. I don't know. I haven't made any sort of correlation or causation there, but let's see. If you look at the Boston game, which I believe was 2 weeks ago today, the Pacers have won 4 of their last 6, so I don't know if there's causation there or not. But
Joe Flacco was theoretically the starter during that abomination in Charlotte. So, you know what I mean? Right there, that alone probably should cost him the gig, right?
I think you might not be going out on a limb to say that has nothing to do with it, but I can't confirm or deny.
Well, we got to tie it all in, right? I mean, come on. This is the way it goes.
Do you think Rick is disappointed now that maybe there won't be as many ticked-off Colts fans, to paraphrase, for the Pacers' home games for the foreseeable future? Or do you envision that that could very well still be at play for him?
I would be surprised if he's given that even 2 seconds of thought. But I listened to almost your whole show yesterday and found it quite worthwhile. And I thought the Stephen Holder segment was very interesting. So hopefully we can keep that standard high here.
Pat, did you lose a bet?
No, I'm never driving because I live so close to the field house, but I was actually out and about most of the day yesterday. So how'd you guys on?
Well, we appreciate that. All right. I'm curious of this, and I had mentioned this. To me, it was one of those signings that I was just very curious about. Pat Boylan joins us, by the way, on the Express Pro Tire and Auto Guest line. You hear him, of course, on the Pacers radio broadcast right here on this radio station, Pacers and Magic Tonight. So when they signed Jahlil Okafor, I mean, it kind of felt like, okay, here's a guy that was a top 5 pick that fell out of favor in the NBA, went overseas, kind of started to re-jump his career, and now he is on the Mad Ants roster. He's within the G League for Indiana. Seemingly didn't mean much, but because they have become so thin at that position, is it possible that ultimately he does get brought in and get into some rotation on a relief basis?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question from a couple of different angles. First, how he would potentially fit with this roster, and then Second, if they feel like they need to make a move at that position. The Jackson injury happened a couple of weeks ago, and so far they have not made any movement. So that would suggest to me that they're not dying to make a move just to make a move, and they feel like they can get potentially through this, at least right now. The rebounding, it's kind of come and gone. It's never really been a strength of this team, but I wouldn't say it's been the reason that they've lost any games. Now, the game in Charlotte, the rebounding was poor, but in general, you went up against a bigger Knicks team and did just fine there, and in general, the rebounding has been all right. So I of course, have no inside information, but I think you're kind of on a wait-and-see approach just in general on whether you've got the 15th roster spot open, so that's always a potential.
And to his credit, he has, and I know that it's, take it with the grain and all that, but he has played well, right? So, I mean, there are a lot of guys probably that would just kind of go through the motions, but he has played well for them in the G League, right?
He has, and he's such an interesting guy because he was drafted so high, because he had this spectacular offensive skill set. And maybe you could argue that teams should have seen, Philadelphia should have seen this coming, because we were in the midst of kind of this revolution of the perimeter-oriented game and all of that, and that he wasn't going to fit. But I don't think that was ever really a question of his skill set. I just think it was the game-changing, a lot of what happened to Roy Hibbert. And so I think the question of, like how he fits, the Pacers with Turner and Jackson had a lot of athleticism and defense around the rim, and I think that's something you obviously value and would like to have. At the same time, he's probably somebody that can go get you, maybe if he got enough playing time, double-digit points per game too. So I'll be interested to watch him with the Mad Ants. I tend to think that he's the acquisition of Okafor is let's see if we can find something here, and then if so, then maybe that's an intriguing option. Very low risk, high reward type move.
Kind of like sure. Wiseman, right? I mean, honestly, before Wiseman got hurt, that's kind of was the same thought process.
Yeah, very similar there. Very similar there. So I think you watch and see what he does, and if he plays great, maybe it's something that they consider. I think there's a fit element at play here too, but I wouldn't say it would shock me.
Pat, we appreciate the time as always. We'll be listening to the broadcast. Magic Pacers tonight should be a good one. And I know Mark will be on the call. You'll be there as well. We look forward to listening to it.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Pat Boylan on the Express Pro Tire and Auto Guest Line. It is interesting, the Okafor deal. I remember when he first signed, I was like, wait a minute, do they have thoughts with him? And I can't remember who we were talking to was saying, well, I mean, he probably – we'll see if he even makes it through onto the G League roster. Then he did, and he's played well, but, I mean, what does that mean, right? How much can you read into that? But – they might be in a position where they've got to bring him up for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean,
we'll see.
You leave no stone unturned when you're looking for depth at that position, and they're going to explore a lot of avenues. Worst case scenario, if they're still in need of help in general with their front court, then maybe they go and look for something at the trade deadline. But that is an area that is going to matter for them as the season goes on, and you're experiencing it now to a smaller extent with your guard play. Is how much can you expect over the course of 10, 15, 20 games, however much it is over the course of an 82-game season, where you're shorthanded, for there not to be losses at the margins for efficiency for this group. So far, it hasn't factored in, and as Pat mentioned, hopefully, as you start to trickle guys back in, like Toppin, like Nembhard, like Nesmith, you're able to stabilize, and you're only really focused on that front court behind Miles for depth.
Did we determine what we're putting the over-under, by the way, on my weight loss during the colonoscopy cleanse tonight?
4.5.
I believe that's what we agreed on.
4.5? That's going to go under that. There's no way I'm going to lose more than 4.5, right?
I mean, we would have to go in depth for a little bit of analytical data on your bowel movements
says on that.
To know that, I think.
The research says the average person loses 5 pounds.
Well, that's fat people, right?
I don't know.
I mean, for what it's worth, right? I mean, I'm not sitting here.
I thought the phrase we used on this program was insulation.
Those are insulated individuals.
That would
right?
be monitored by
Eddie,
the
you're
HR
not
department.
a fat guy. I mean, you've got a little bit of insulation, but now you have made it's hoodie season, right? So that's good.
Yeah. Thank you. That makes me feel so much better.
Well, I noticed that you have a wide array of hoodies that you wear.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't list you as...
I'd rather wear hoodies and shorts than pants and a T-shirt.
Okay. Now, and it's your girlfriend that said you were insulated, right?
I can't remember. Oh, yeah.
Yes, it was.
I think it was.
Yeah.
And how did she word it exactly?
I can't remember now. I can't.
Was she saying it in a positive, like that? Like there's two ways that you can take that. One of them is like, oh no, you're not fat, you're just insulated, and then the other is, well, you've got a little extra insulation.
Yeah, I can't remember. If I'm being honest, I tried to forget about that, so it doesn't send me down the wrong path.
What about if she's like, here, I saw this larger hoodie, I thought you'd like it. I'm just saying.
Anyway, I'm taking the over 4.5. I'm going over for the
Okay.
pounds lost.
I've already officially weighed in. I did it this morning. I did the official weigh-in,
Okay.
and then I will do the official weigh-in tomorrow morning after having gone through.
Were you happy with the number?
What's that?
Were you happy with the number?
No. But yes, because I thought, I'll be honest with you, when I was on vacation, I just assumed that I probably gained.
Right,
I
you said
was
that.
like, I had a beer like it. I mean, we didn't go hog wild,
No,
right?
but all bets are
on
off. You're not
vacation,
worried
right?
about what's happening. Yeah,
correct.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have fish and chips, and I tried that haggis. Is that what it's called?
Sure.
The Scottish dish. You don't know about haggis?
I don't.
It's a Scottish dish that's made of the heart, lungs, liver, and then in traditional fashion, and I can't remember of what animal. I hate to say that. A lamb, I think.
Okay.
Or a sheep.
I'll stick with the shepherd's pie.
And then in traditional form, it's lined, it's wrapped around by the stomach lining.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, that was. Yeah. But I mean, when in
You
Rome,
might-
right?
Speaking of stomach lining, we'll figure out
So,
where things
no,
are at.
Would
I
you
would like-
say, Jake, you are at a normal weight?
You mean normal for me?
I don't know. For you, yes.
In your last doctor visits, have they said, Jake, you could lose a couple pounds?
No,
they
no.
always say that.
Right,
I mean, I'm 6'4".
right.
I'm 52 years old.
Yes.
And typically, like the day before I left vacation, I was at 202.5 pounds.
Okay. I would say on a chart that matches up for your height and everything.
Okay, then I'll probably go under on the 4.5.
Yeah, see? We'll see, right?
I'll stand by it.
On average, it's 5 pounds. However,
I think 3.5 is a good number.
it
for the
literally
over-under.
it ranges from 2 to 12 pounds depending on the individual.
12 pounds.
Those already at a normal weight tend to lose
What
less
are
than
you
the
eating
overweight
that
patients.
you go through a cleanse process in 24 hours where you lose 12 pounds? What did you eat on the 2 days before your colonoscopy where you lose 12 pounds? What in the hell? Like, what did you eat? Like the entire pig on Wednesday?
A lot of
Your
stomach lining.
colonoscopy's on Thursday?
A lot of stomach lining.
Wow. 12 pounds. Holy cow. Can you imagine the feeling that would
Literally.
be? Yeah, I lost 12 pounds in 24 hours.
That's an ad campaign.
That does not feel healthy at all. What like that? See, here's the thing: the 12-pound. What they're not telling you is that was somebody who on the same day gave a colonoscopy and donated an organ. Anthony Richardson is back as the starting quarterback of the Colts. That announcement earlier today from Shane Steichen, and we've been talking a lot about it. I am curious. I would imagine. And I'm curious of this. Do you think fans, Jimmy, see this as thank goodness because this is what I want to see? Or do you think the fans see it as this feels terribly inconsistent and what are they doing because they're changing all over the place?
I think it's more the former, and that's where it's going to lean in the next couple of days. I think immediately, sure, there's frustration of where's the consistency from a franchise, and I get that. I don't defend what the Colts did with the benching in the first place, but this is the path you're supposed to be back on. This is the path of Anthony Richardson needs reps to I'm not even saying he's going to develop into the franchise guy, but you can't go into another offseason with these type of questions when at least a year ago it was, well, he was hurt. There's nothing you could do. This was fully in your control to give him the keys back, and they've done that. So do I think that inconsistent messaging might bother some Colts fans? Sure, but playoffs and making noise there weren't realistic with Joe Flacco. I'm not saying they are with Anthony Richardson, but you're achieving two objectives here. You now have optimism for at least answers of where the franchise is going, and it's not a step backwards for where they were with Band-Aids in the past. And with where the schedule is, let's say they beat the Jets. Okay, now that picture becomes a little bit clearer of Detroit and then a lot of winnable games the rest of the way. If you achieve both, Richardson reps plus playoffs, then you're going to have a lot of happy people that might be confused or upset today.
Here's the thing I hope is not the case, but I don't think you can rule it out. I hope it's not the case that this is an example of the Colts giving in to perceptions and pressure. Because there was now, internally within the locker room, maybe. I mean, is this Shane Steichen listening to his locker room and feeling out what the locker room wanted? That's
and those
possible.
are two different things.
Totally. People are saying, like, do you think this is because season ticket renewals are due? And that
I don't.
I have a hard time believing that. That is a scary way to run your franchise. If you are running your franchise, the reality is this. Players tell you all the time. They don't listen to the radio. They don't look at social media. Players tell you that all the time. None of it's true, but they all say that, right? But general managers and team presidents and coaches, they absolutely have to be immune to and completely deaf to what the narrative is and not allow that to compromise the direction that they see fit for a franchise.
What's that old adage? If you listen to the fans, you wind up in the stands. I mean, that's pretty much where you are. If that's
Correct.
what happened here, I don't think that's what happened.
No,
whether it's
I don't
locker
either.
room or whether it is realizing Flacco wasn't moving the needle, I think those are more
I'm
likely
with you
reasons.
in the fact that it is almost impossible to fathom that would have been a factor in this.
Ballard wouldn't have waited 4 years to draft a quarterback post-luck if he was listening to the fans. Let's be clear on that. Like, there's plenty of areas where
Correct.
he could have caved to fan pressure before now for this to be the ultimatum.
But I think what happens and what happened today, and we'll let you hear from Shane Steichen and Anthony Richardson coming up here. And once you listen to them and once you hear it, I think if you listen closely enough, you can hear, if I was on the air in 2007, I think, here in this building when an earthquake happened, and you don't hear the seismic change underneath you of an earthquake until it's happening, right? And I'm not saying an earthquake happened at 56th Street, but if you listen closely, you might hear the rumblings of a shift that took place with this announcement. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about, and we'll let you hear from both next. Hi, I'm Jake Query, just sitting here preparing for my 12-pound weight loss venture.
Testimonial coming.
Man, 12 pounds.
Hi, Jake.
Over under, I think 3.5.
I'll take the over either
You
way.
set it at 4.5. I'll go under.
But if I put it at 3, if the line moved to 3.5, what would you put it?
What do you mean?
I'm gladly taking. He's saying if he changes it to 3.5,
If the line
live lines
changes
are
to the
moved.
3.5 in terms of the over-under of number of pounds I'm going to lose through the colonoscopy prep cleanse. I weighed myself this morning. I will weigh myself tomorrow. If I put the line at 3.5, do you take the over or the under?
Under?
I'm going all chips in on the over at that point.
Okay. Fair enough.
All chips in. Period.
The period's the best part, of course.
Yep, the dismount.
What we now know is that Anthony Richardson's back as the starting quarterback of the Colts. And, yes, it is a surprise. And I think what this has done is this has moved the pressures away from Shane Steichen onto Chris Ballard. Because Shane Steichen's job is to win football games. And by taking Anthony Richardson out of the starting lineup, putting in Joe Flacco, saying that Joe Flacco is the guy moving forward, that was Shane Steichen saying, whether he believed it or not, the message simply was, this is what I think is the best for this team to win. And it seemed as though they were pivoting away from the development and the growth of Anthony Richardson. Now, and it was hard to believe, it was hard to imagine that through just 10 games, they already had made that determination that enough was enough. Precedent would say that, in fact, it is very hard for a player that is drafted high and given the keys of the franchise to be removed and then reinserted back into the starting lineup and find success. Although, for just 2 weeks, it's not like he was completely collecting rust. I will maintain that whatever, if in fact this was about Anthony Richardson learning how to be a better professional, it's pretty easy to mask that kind of thing in 2 weeks. It doesn't mean that it is, in fact, a permanent habit and that you can be an Eddie Haskell. I'm not saying Anthony Richardson is. I'm saying if Richardson knew there were areas that he needed to improve upon, it's not hard to do that over the course of 2 weeks. But what this now does is this now shifts all of the pressure and the spotlight onto Chris Ballard. Because now this is back to, okay, they are in fact seeing what they have in Anthony Richardson, and now that they've gone back to him, theoretically for at minimum the rest of this season, maybe even beyond that, by doing that, the way it appears is that they are saying, okay, we are going back to Anthony Richardson to give it the totality of fairness before we can make a judgment on him. And he may become the best quarterback in the AFC. I don't know. But if he does it now, and if the Colts maintain this level of complete chaos and internal strife and everything that it appears they have, then at that point there is nobody more to blame than Chris Ballard, and he absolutely is attached at the success or failure of Anthony Richardson. And if Anthony Richardson fails now, there is no more excuse because he has been disciplined, he has been taught and reminded and shown now the things that he needs to do. He is apparently aware of those things. He is going to go out there now. There is no more excuse of, well, but there are things that he needs to learn. There are things that he needs to see. There are things that he needs to step back and reevaluate. Apparently, that's all taking place. So now it comes down to his success or failure is directly linked to the future status of Chris Ballard.
Well, and the onus should always have been on Chris Ballard, and that's where it was to start the year. And then the last couple of weeks with this weird switch to Joe Flacco, be it for the multitude of reasons we've gone over. Disciplinary purposes, work ethic, commitment to win now, whatever the case was, a lot of that you can just throw aside as hyperbole or falsehoods because they've pivoted back now after 2 games to the quarterback they said didn't give them the best chance to win. But all of that just clouded the real problems that I still feel with this franchise, which goes back to Chris Ballard and this tour of trying to prove everybody wrong, myself included, of his capacity as a general manager with the lack of results for the better part of the last 7 years. And you compare his resume, as we've done ad nauseum, to other general managers around the league. And I'm not saying that Shane Steichen, if this thing goes south the rest of the year, is going to be absolved of total blame. The Colts might very well do what a lot of organizations do if it gets to this point, where they will clean house altogether and Steichen will be gone along with Chris Ballard. But I'm not using Chris Ballard's words against him, because his words should have been used against him at some point earlier than this over the last 7 seasons. He said it, last year or 2 years ago, that the second I take a quarterback, that's going to be the excuse for you guys to run me out of town. I'm paraphrasing that slightly. I would argue I'd been trying to run him out of town before that, but he's right. When you get the opportunity to take the quarterback, and you could have, by the way, and I stand by this was my thoughts on where they go on draft night or during draft season of 2022. The Panthers took a swing when they traded with the Bears to go up to number 1. They just took the wrong guy.
Right.
I wanted C.J. Stroud. The Colts could have done a similar package to what the Panthers did if they fully believed in Stroud. They didn't do that. They liked where the board fell.
Well, they said, Jimmy, was we would have taken him number 1.
They reiterated the fact they would have taken him number 1, and Richardson was their guy. So where you're at now, regardless of where the rest of the season goes, and regardless of it being a return to what the objective was this year, Jake, out of the gate, which is Richardson's development, is this was Chris Ballard's guy, this was his selection, and it might not be a finished product through the rest of the year, but you can't keep kicking this proverbial can down the road without accountability at some point rearing its ugly head for this front office. And that can't be kicked all the way to July of 2025. Now it's back, and now you observe game by game what Richardson's going to do. And by the way, Stephen Holder said this yesterday. I had mentioned it after the game as well. I know what Richardson has done so far has created such a low bar for what is success for him. I've rewatched that Texans game. He made strides. They weren't great world-changing strides, but it was growth there. He was the victim of a lot of drops. He was the victim of failed pass rush. There are areas where improvement was happening. Does that mean he's the answer long-term? I don't know, but you can't sit here and sell to your fan base he needs to learn when we all knew it was horse apples, because you told us all last summer he's learned. He's
I've never
completely
heard that term horse apples.
He's completely absorbed what he needed to learn.
Is a horse apple an apple a horse eats, or is that
it's a great
euphemism
question.
For...
I think he wanted to say a different word than he realized where he was going, he had to come up with a word.
It's a great question. For the record, I have used horse apples in the past. Yes, you are correct in what it's subbing. Yes.
So it's like a cow patty.
Yes. Right.
Not
a cow
really,
pie. Sure, yeah.
A cow pie.
Yeah,
It's not really a pie made of cow,
correct.
right?
Right, yes.
So
Correct.
a horse apple is
Correct.
exactly that.
Like they told you from the get-go.
Can you imagine a 12-pound horse apple?
After a colonoscopy or before?
The horse has the colonoscopy and then has the 12-pound apple, right?
Why the timeline never made sense to me is they said all offseason that he learned when he was injured. And then to say the last 2 weeks that the maturity's not there, he hasn't learned. You're talking out of both sides of your mouth. You needed a return to at least what the normal outlook was to start the year, which is Flacco's a veteran that's there in case of emergencies. Anthony Richardson needs to prove himself, and it starts on Sunday against the Jets.
Joel A. Erickson, 20 minutes. before we came on the air today, the big news out at West 56th, if you are just joining us on the program.
Where in the world have you been?
That is exactly correct. Shane Steichen with this bit of information that was, quite frankly, candid but surprising in his meeting with the media today.
I want to address, Anthony's situation. I've said the process for a long time. And what I mean by that, it's the attention to detail in everything he does, from the classrooms to the walkthroughs to practice to the weight room, all those little things, right? It just got to be at a higher standard. And that's what was talked about, and that's where we went with it. And so that was discussed with him 2 weeks ago. And those are the conversations that took place. And over the last 2 weeks, he's made strides in those areas, big-time strides, becoming a pro's pro. And is he a finished product? No, he's not. And it's my job to help him get there along with the rest of the coaching staff. But he's a hell of a talent. Like I said, we've never lost faith or belief in him and his abilities. And he's shown strides. He really has. And with that being said, he will be our starter again. He's going to start this week. He's going to start the rest of the season. All right, and we're going to go from there. And I informed Joe of the decision yesterday. He's the ultimate pro. He respects the decision, understands it. I talked to the team this morning about it as well. I informed them of the decision. And look, everyone has a different journey, right? Everyone has a different way, development and how you go about the process, and everyone wants instant gratification right now. And sometimes it doesn't work like that. And you fight through these times. And I love Anthony. He's a great person. Got great faith in him and his abilities to be our franchise quarterback.
Anthony Richardson then had the following to say.
I feel like there's still room for improvement, all around. But lately I've been working on consistency. That's always been a thing of mine, just trying to perfect that and just get better at that, just being consistent in all aspects. But this week and the past couple of weeks, I've been trying to focus on, sacrifice some more, The guys ask me to do certain things, even if I don't feel like doing it, you got to do it because you're sacrificing. They're doing it, so why not do it?
It was extra note-taking, getting here early, staying what, tangible things did you have to kind of go out there and do?
Just showing them that I could do my work, day in and day out consistently. As a pro, you feel like, okay, I'm doing my work, I'm getting it done. That's enough, but it's never enough. Especially not for the vets. They feel like if they got to do the extra work, you got to do it too. So that's how it's supposed to be.
Okay, so we basically would be like David Puddy from Seinfeld if we're going to the Colts game because we wouldn't have to paint our face. We've been talking about this till we're blue in it. So I'm curious what other people, I think you know how we feel about this, just in terms of the interpretations of what has been said, what it means for the franchise. We go to the phone lines at 239-1070 where the director of honesty, Sam, joins us because I am interested in the fan perspective of this news and the reaction. Hi, Sam. How are you?
Hey, Jake. Very good, man. Very good. Jimmy, great work these last couple weeks. Well, here's where I got a whole bullet list here. But first off, I wanted to thank Flacco. He really did us a favor on this one. If he played well and then we're sitting at the same spot next season, that really does nothing for us. But it's 2 weeks enough, slap on the wrist to get it through, to really humble AR to say, hey, we got to start taking this serious. AR's got a ways to go. These next 7-8 weeks left. Can you go from 44% to what's a usable quarterback? 58?
Yeah, I was going to say 55 probably should be a benchmark. Over 50, certainly, right, Sam?
Can we go from 44 to 56? Okay, that's really and that's my first thing right there. Also, another thing that, and I think that's Ballard's. I would like to say, job on the line, but he's got a couple of years of AR's young. But another thing, I was happy to hear Kenny and the guys speak out. We haven't played complimentary football in how many? And it's been a while now. I mean, Sunday night against the Vikings, we played great defense, and once again, to this team, we keep on talking quarterback. But at what point are we going to talk about winning football?
Well, listen, I think, and Sean, or Sam, excuse me, I appreciate the call. A couple of things. Number one, I don't know if you should hang a banner at Lucas Oil that just says, Flacco, thank you for sucking, right? Because basically that's what we're getting at, right? In terms of the locker room itself, Sam, I think part of it is I don't think this was the ultimate deciding factor, but Jimmy, you can't overlook the fact that there is the possibility they were losing the locker room. And maybe they were losing the locker room because players were like, look, Joe Flacco is, you went to him because you wanted to make a point, but we're not winning games now. And I've only got, in other words, with Anthony Richardson at quarterback, there's at least plausible expectation or plausible reasoning that players can get behind. If you are, in particular, a player that's in your prime, and you look at it and Anthony Richardson is the quarterback, you kind of knew what you were signing up for. You knew that this was a franchise that was building around a young player that's kind of a unicorn. And even though there's going to be ups and downs and peaks and valleys and losing isn't fun, losing is at least more palpable as a player if you know that it's because of a vision. But if you're losing games because you've got Weekend at Bernie's out there and it's just the same thing over and over of an old retread quarterback, eventually you're like, look, man, what are we doing here? And I do think that I think now we have a better idea what Kenny Moore was talking about when he said doing the same things over and over and over. I don't even know that it was talking about consistency as much as just you are putting us in the same position year in and year out. And I think Steichen knew they were about to lose the locker room.
Well, when they benched Richardson for Flacco last month, one thing that kept bubbling up to the surface was, think about all the veterans on this team that are wanting to go compete for a title and seeing their years waste away. And that was a fair point. But the one thing that didn't get brought up as pushback to that was the following. How many veterans on that Colts roster have lived through the Band-Aid on top of the Band-Aid on top of the Band-Aid post Andrew Luck, and have seen the movie we've been talking about where you throw a veteran QB out there thinking he has some life left, and it flames out the same way season after season? How many veterans have seen that movie and realized, well, if we keep putting Joe Flacco out there, this is the same boat next year with the same questions for Anthony Richardson? So to that end, Jake, there could have been a wide variety of ways the locker room was involved here, but if I'm a veteran on that team, I'm more so frustrated with the idea of this constant loop you've been in where Phillip Rivers, Carson Wentz, Matt Ryan, Gardner Minshew, Joe Flacco, that's been the last 5 years for you. You need some type of vision to get behind as you're outlining, and I think that more than anything, if it did cause any frustration in the locker room, was I've been on this train as a veteran for 3, 4, 5 seasons. I know how this ends.
If you are Kenny Moore, if you're DeForest Buckner, then Joe Flacco, I mean, this is no disrespect to these guys who have been good players in their career, but Joe Flacco is Gardner Minshew, is Phillip Rivers, is Carson, maybe not Carson Wentz, because Carson Wentz you thought was a multi-year guy, but is Matt Ryan. I mean, yeah, they've been through that, right? They're well aware of the drill. Joel A. Erickson joins us next. Obviously, the big story and a lot of different ways to interpret and look at it. Anthony Richardson back as the starting quarterback of the Colts. He will make his return under center against the New York Jets coming up this weekend. Joining us now on the Express Pro Tire and Auto Guest Line, you can read his work at the Indianapolis Star. Joel A. Erickson joins us. Joel, I'll begin with this. If you had to pinpoint it, I know that Shane Steichen says this was his decision and just his decision. So it was a 2-game absence for Anthony Richardson. 10 years from now, when the 30 for 30 comes out, we'll find out the reason he was not in the lineup was what?
I think we find out that there was maybe more than just the inaccuracy to what was to the reasons for his poor play through the first 6 starts or whatever this season. You know, I don't know. It seems a little bit ridiculous that you could fix all that preparation stuff in 2 weeks, at least at first glance. But I kind of wondered, and you know, I think if you go back and listen to like the first press conference, myself and your guy Kevin Bowen were both kind of asking, you know, what else is there beyond that stuff that we're not seeing? And I think that there's probably some details there that haven't come out in terms of stuff that just wasn't getting picked up. And it could be a really, really wide range of different things that you can't necessarily see while watching the game. But I think there was some of that stuff probably being missed.
Yeah, to me, if it was strictly look, you got to get in here earlier. You got to ask more questions in film sessions. You've got to pick the brain of Joe Flacco, those things. Do you really realistically have an answer on whether or not those things have been cured in 2 weeks? That just feels very Eddie Haskell-esque to me.
It feels a little too neat. I agree with that. And maybe you don't. Maybe you felt like, you know, you just needed it. It's almost like they just felt like they needed to get his attention, at least based on what we know. But I also kind of thought that, you know, if you were just going off of like the inaccuracy, that kind of thing, for why you benched him in the first place, that didn't really make sense. And I kind of always felt like there had to be something more going on. And I kind of understand why maybe you don't feel like you'd say it until now, because, you know, you don't want Steichen really tried to, you know, really emphasize today, great kid, and anytime you start talking about preparation and stuff like that, that you're going to go somewhere else with it. But I agree, there is a piece of it that you're like, can you fix all that in 2 weeks? Steichen said over and over again that Joe Flacco's play didn't have anything to do with it. I don't know for sure. If Joe Flacco threw 4 touchdowns and no picks, and they were 1-1 in these last 2 games, are we at this spot? I'm not sure.
Hey, do you think he was hurt? Talking about Richardson.
Well, he was. I think he was a little bit banged up, but I don't think that's why they benched him. Because
okay.
I think that Richardson has gotten to a point where, like, the whole narrative around him has been, this guy gets hurt all the time, and I don't think he wants that to be the case anymore. So that's just my guess there.
What do you make of the win now prerogative? Because in theory, they're still mathematically alive in the playoff race, even if that's bleak. Where does that rank in terms of ciphering through all they said the last 2 weeks when they benched Richardson in the first place?
Well, I mean, Joe Flacco wasn't doing enough to help them win now, would be my general answer. You know, 6 turnovers. They, for whatever reason, they struggle to run the ball when they don't have a mobile quarterback back there. I think that's something that maybe doesn't make a ton of sense to me, that they can't, because, you know, and I know the fun thing is to just say that everything Frank Reich did was bad, but he used to be able to get Jonathan Taylor going even when everybody in the building knew that they were going to run the ball and they didn't have a mobile quarterback back there. So I think there's probably more ways to run the ball than they've shown. But with this staff, basically what we've seen is that it's a lot harder for them to run the ball when they don't have the mobile quarterback in there. So that helps. And the other thing is just, like, what you get in completion percentage, you're losing in the fact that you're not really pushing the ball downfield at all, and you've got all these turnovers. So I think from a win now perspective, if you got two quarterbacks who have not played well so far, you go with the one who might get better as opposed to the one who's clearly in decline.
Joel A. Erickson is our guest. He joins us on the Express Pro Tire and Auto guest line. Joel, what do you think? And I don't mean what guys have said. I mean, you've been around this a long time, right? You can kind of tell, and I think people understand that when you cover sports for a long time, your BS meter is pretty good, right? You can just kind of tell when guys are speaking through to say the right things. What do you think has been the locker room mood of the Indianapolis Colts at the end of the Joe Flacco period and back into Anthony Richardson? Take us through kind of the wave of the emotion of the locker room.
I think there was some frustration with the move away from Richardson to Flacco, just because these guys have been through. I think some of the same stuff that's true of the fan base is true of the locker room. Like, they've been through the quarterback changing all the time and being told that, well, somebody's the guy and then they're not the guy and all that stuff. And with Richardson, maybe he was young, but at least like there was the possibility of, hey, this is our guy, and we're with him for a little while, or for a while, whether it's good or bad. And there were a couple players that referenced that in one way or the other when the move first happened. I think that's part of it. And this move back, so this is maybe too behind the scenes, but like when big news like this breaks, I kind of have to make sure the story's up fast on Indy Star. So like today, in the wake of this move, as soon as Richardson stopped talking, I headed back to my computer. So I didn't get to hear a lot today, but I did think that there was I felt like there might have been some frustration with being put through another quarterback change a couple weeks ago.
How would you, Joel A. Erickson is our guest, covers the Colts for the Indy Star. I know we're just tea leaf reading, but this mattered when he got benched. I'm curious what it was now. How would you describe Richardson's overall body language and the way he handled himself in the media scrums today compared to October 30th and that whole week when it was announced he was getting benched?
I don't know, maybe you'd expect a little bit more, like, just kind of from some of the stuff we've seen from him in terms of, like, the way he kind of celebrates and stuff online, like, a little more exuberant. He wasn't like that. He was a little bit more, like the quote that I just listened to and was thinking about was where he said something along the lines of, I've got to make sure I keep this. It felt like there was a little bit of a, like, trying to think of the right word, determination, like set, like sort of, it's you sit for 2 games, and I think it's really hard to kind of come out of that and just be kind of the same happy-go-lucky. So I think that was the biggest thing that stuck out was it was a little bit more sort of set jaw, I thought, today.
Do you think there was any weight with the public comments from Kenny Moore, Julian Blackmon, and Zaire Franklin in terms of the overall direction of where this franchise was headed this season based on locker room perspective?
With Richardson?
With the switchback, yes. Like them to change course, how much of that do you think weighed in with the fact that you have guys who, I mean, Kenny Moore said it, he's not going to sugarcoat things, but that type of blunt honesty, you just don't get that from a ton of locker rooms around the league.
I think that I think Kenny had specific examples in mind, and he didn't share those with us for the reasons of, people are always like, I want them to share those examples with us. But if he had, we would have all killed Kenny for, bringing it, like, calling people out in public. I get the impression that he had specific examples in mind, and he wanted to get people's attention.
Well, in that same vein, Joel, the leadership council and all of that. I mean, I've made Fortress of Solitude jokes, all I want, but like in all seriousness, they clearly take those veterans' voices seriously enough to meet with him every week, right?
Yeah, and I do think that obviously plays a role in it, but based on what we're hearing in terms of, based on what Kenny said and what they're saying about like preparation and stuff like that, I don't necessarily think that. I mean, I doubt Flacco is the one that he was talking about in terms of preparation.
Sure.
Do you think Joel A. Erickson's our guest, Express Pro Tire and Auto Guest Line? Joel, I asked yesterday another guest on the program, Stephen Holder, who you know. I asked him a question in relation to the television show The Voice. So I'm going to do that again. You've seen the TV show The Voice, right?
I have, yes.
Okay. So somebody gets up there and sings, and then all of the judges have their back to the singer, and then they push a button, they turn around, and that means that they want to coach that person. They want that person on their team, right? So Anthony Richardson is on the stage. Chris Ballard, Jim Irsay, and Shane Steichen are all sitting in their chairs. Which of the three is the first one to push the button?
Ballard. He's the guy who, as long as he's been here, especially with young guys, preaches patience. And so, he was the one at the beginning of the season more than anybody else, although the other guys did say it too, but he was the one saying there's going to be some roller coaster moments. We got to hang with it. That's the first one that jumped to mind. The other thing that jumped to mind was all three chairs should probably turn around, just because that's the potential for a future here with this team. Whereas, regardless of whether or not you make the playoffs with Flacco, which based on the last 2 weeks, and honestly, some of what we saw before was always less likely than we put this guy in and we're going to immediately win. But Flacco's 39. There's nothing beyond that. So really, they should all be pushing it and turning around, because if Richardson ends up not being the future, my goodness, this franchise is in a spot.
Okay, so in your opinion, Joel, which of those three is the one actually that is the most aggressively and the most regularly pushing buttons?
All I know is Steichen right now. I don't have anything concrete enough to say that anybody else is. So right now it's Steichen.
So you do believe Steichen when he says, look, this was my move? Because the only reason I say that is because Shane Steichen was so effusive 3 days ago. He was so adamant 3 days ago about the fact that, Joe is our starter from here against the Jets and moving forward. And then, boom, such an about-face, right? It is peculiar.
He did that the first time, too. He did that the first time, too, where he said, after the game, it was all Anthony's our guy, and then it was Flacco. I don't know. I'll say this. I don't know that you can read as much into Steichen's comments as you can in, say, other head coaches. Just because he doesn't give us as much and doesn't explain as much as other head coaches do. I think that's something I'm learning this season, is not to put a ton of stock, but some of the future forward-making proclamation stuff, maybe take it with a grain of salt going forward based on what we've had the last couple of weeks.
What do you make of him elaborating today in regards to that process, where he finally stresses what Richardson's process is, where he talks about detail everything that he does, classroom, walkthroughs to practice? He was very vague in regards to what the process was for Richardson, and now he kind of laid that out there today. For a coach that, as you mentioned, is pretty ambiguous, did that surprise you?
A little bit. Maybe that's a lesson learned from sort of the furor that not saying anything has created over the last couple of weeks. But it's also possible that I think in the beginning they probably are trying to protect Richardson a little bit. Because again, I think you probably could have said some version of this 2 weeks ago and people would have accepted it. But maybe they felt like they needed to protect Richardson. Maybe Steichen felt like he needed to protect Richardson by not saying it. So I think that, if you feel like he's through it, then maybe you feel like you don't have to necessarily protect as much of of where he is and take some of the, because the other thing is, by not saying anything, we've all been focused mainly on, we've been focused a little bit on Richardson, but we've all been focused mainly on Steichen the past couple of weeks, as opposed to Richardson. I don't know if that was his goal, but that's the way it worked out.
Indy Star beat writer for the Colts, Joel A. Erickson, joins us on the Express Pro Tire and Auto guest line. Conventional wisdom would say a lot of things. I've thrown out conventional wisdom with this franchise long ago. That being said, with them pivoting back now, barring injury, is the Grim Reaper's scythe over Anthony Richardson's head the rest of this season where they could pivot back? Or is this firmly, definitively, where there's not right now vagueness at the end of his proclamation that Richardson's going to start the rest of the season? They can't go back on that now, right? Or is this scythe still going to follow him until season's end?
They can, because they've said one thing and then done the other before, but realistically, they should stick with Richardson. Like, you've got to find out. Like, if it was the preparation and you feel like that might have been why he wasn't playing as well, you've got to find out if that's the truth going forward. And maybe they don't feel like this, but I think benching him for 2 weeks sort of speeds up that timetable a little bit on when do we got to know, when do we got to make a decision. Not that there's good options in the offseason this year if he's not the guy, but you should be sticking with him because, again, like I said, I don't think we really have a ton that says this team is much, much better offensively with Joe Flacco. I think it actually might be the other way after we've got the last 2 weeks to look at. This team is pretty limited offensively when they have Joe Flacco, regardless of the completion percentage.
Joel, did Anthony Richardson seem like a different guy to you? Did he seem relieved?
A little bit.
Did he?
A little bit. Like I said, I felt like there was a little bit more of like a little bit less sort of happy-go-lucky and a little bit more like, set jaw type of demeanor. Now, hopefully he doesn't feel like he can't ever be that guy again. But, I did feel like there was a little bit of a difference.
But I think it's worth pointing out for people that may not know. And Joel, I always point out, we don't know athletes, coaches. It's like any other walk of life, right? I mean, you can know of people and be around them, but doesn't mean you necessarily know the ins and outs of them. But Anthony Richardson, at least to this point in terms of his tenure with the Colts, has never appeared to be a bad guy, right? And not even necessarily like, and I don't mean immature in the fact of like he's Johnny Manziel out at clubs till 2 a.m. either. I just think that there were some perhaps expectations of leadership that he had yet to learn. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and he said today, you think you're doing all the right things, and maybe you don't realize that there's another level to go to. I think the other piece of this is just, like, yes, he's young, but he also didn't start that much in college. Like,
right.
You think about the other guys that Steichen's come up with. Jalen Hurts had been through hell at Alabama to get to Oklahoma, and Justin Herbert, maybe not quite the same thing, but he'd been through some stuff at Oregon that sort of, kind of hardens you a little bit for what you have to do preparation-wise. Richardson didn't really get that chance because he wasn't a starter. It's an entirely different thing to kind of get, maybe not you're not in the starting lineup. They don't want to go to you your first 2 years at Florida, and then they give you the starting chance as junior versus Hurts being the starter at Alabama, losing the job to Tua, and then having to come back and reprove himself as a draft prospect at Oklahoma.
Joel, in conclusion, tell me the storyline of the Colts that is the biggest bubbling storyline that has been totally overshadowed and masked by this story.
That's a great question. Can they figure out the offense? And I know this is part of it, but do they have a good grip on what the offense is for Richardson? And we've talked about it some with the decision, but I think so much of it has been about Flacco, that kind of thing. Like, are we going to see them take a jump offensively? Because we've had a ton of questions after each game. Do they know what the offensive identity is? That's one of the things that they didn't say offensive identity, but Blackman and Moore said. They said, what's the identity of this team? I think offensively that's true too, and we've talked about it. I don't know that it's really come into focus because of all the quarterback switching.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only thing that's been consistent so far is the inconsistency, and at some point it's going to have to, you got to pick which way you're going and stick with it. Otherwise, the reputation of the Colts of being just a franchise in disarray is going to continue for yet another year. But we'll see what happens. Joel Erickson will be covering all of it for the Indy Star on the Express Pro Tire and Auto Guest Line, the conversation today. Joel, appreciate it, man.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Going to be interesting stuff for certain. Now, in terms of football from a collegiate standpoint, last night the college football rankings came out. I think I've told you the story, Jimmy, about, have you been to Idaho, Jimmy?
No, not like maybe pass through, but not in a long-term point, no.
You passed through Idaho?
Sure.
You just were driving through like the panhandle or down below?
I regret the answer. I have no idea. No, I've not been to Idaho.
Just seems like a kind of place.
Yeah, I realize that now that I said it, that probably not. Statistically
Eddie,
speaking,
you've been to
no,
Idaho?
I've not driven through Idaho.
Yes, Jake, I have.
Thank you.
Really?
You are oh yeah, Jake. Or Jimmy.
When?
You just passed through.
I passed through.
With you. You guys were on
Does it matter?
It was a road
You were
trip.
just out driving out one night and you just passed through.
We took the long way to Seattle. We just decided that we'd stop
I
through.
went to
scenic route.
San Diego in high school to visit my buddy, and yeah.
You just drove from San Diego to Idaho?
Oh, yeah.
What a convenient weekend trip.
Wanted
right?
to go see the Vandals play.
Like, what are you doing this weekend? I don't know. You want to? Now, let's just guess. I'm going to guess how far it is from the drive from San Diego to. Well, now the Vandals are in, I believe, Pocatello, which is way up north. But let's just say to the border, San Diego to Boise. I'm going to guess that it is a. I'm thinking out loud here, boy. I'm going to say that is a 15-and-a-half-hour drive. Did you put it in, Jimmy?
No, I just was re-looking. Yeah, so just to clarify, no, I've never been to Idaho, Jake, in any capacity.
Well, I think we now know that. Can you look up, Eddie, how far it is from San Diego to Boise?
954 miles.
Okay, and that would be how far in terms of time distance, does it say?
14 hours and 18 minutes.
I'll tell
so
you
it's
how
up by an
Eddie
hour.
was in Idaho. Eddie, you were in Seattle last year, right?
April.
So
this year.
perhaps while enjoying the local product, Eddie went wandering.
That's right.
And wound up in Idaho.
Nope.
But it's farther than you think. Although, I'll tell you what, that drive, if you were to drive from Seattle to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, through the northern panhandle, it's as beautiful as any drive
Really?
that you're going to make. Yeah, honestly, it is gorgeous. But
yeah,
Indiana
Jake, I've been
has-
to Idaho.
What's that?
I've been to Idaho.
That's right. Now that you think about it, right? Indiana has something in common with Idaho, and it's not just the first letter of the alphabet. More specifically, the Indiana Hoosiers have something in common with Boise State. And I'll tell you what that is, and we'll talk about last night's ranking next. College football playoff rankings were announced last night. It was at the conclusion of pretty good game last night at Michigan State and Kansas, and then after that game is when they kept saying, like, college football playoff, up next, whatever. And then they went to it, and the only couple of things about that college football playoff ranking unveiling last night. First off, it is obviously bizarre to be watching it, although we can, we're past the point now of talking about how surreal it is that Indiana's involved, right? But you're watching it. But then also the length of time you're waiting to hear Indiana's name. You're sitting there and you're like, and first off, why is LSU ranked? Why? I mean, why is LSU? What are we doing here?
Love some SEC, baby.
Come on. But you're sitting there and there goes LSU's name, and there goes Clemson's name, and there goes Colorado, and there goes Georgia, and there goes Ole Miss, and there goes Alabama, and there goes Miami, and there goes Notre Dame, there goes Tennessee, and you're like, and they still have yet to say Indiana here. Secondly, the little background music they played, which is kind of a cool suspense, like violin music that was in the background, kind of the undertone as they were making the announcements. Once your brain heard that music, then it drove you crazy because it was like a 4-second song on loop for like 3.5 minutes. That drove me a little crazy. And then the other thing, and I can't be alone in this, and I will readily admit to everybody, it took me, I got to think on the numbers here, 31 years to graduate from college, 32. And that is primarily because I had to avoid the math classes like the plague because I had taken and either dropped or failed algebra 7 times. So I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, okay? Having said that, I was thoroughly confused when they're like, now, this is the team that's ranked 4th, but keep in mind, because they're ranked 4th, they actually slot 8th, but that could be 7th after and they would play here, but that doesn't mean much, and it was just like, oh, what is happening here?
Sure.
What is it that is like that confuses you also? There's something else in this sports world that does that.
There's a lot that does that. There's a lot that does that. But this one in particular, you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah,
because even though you are ranked, then you have seeding that takes place.
Still looking at it, I'm confused. I had to look at it 4 times to definitively come to the conclusion Georgia's not in it right now. Like, because you still see it, and they're 12 in the post rankings, but they're not in it. It's Boise State that's there.
Okay, which leads to the thing that Boise State has in common with Indiana. Boise State and Indiana are the only 2 teams that are ranked in the college football playoff that have not beaten a ranked team. It's not really Indiana's fault. I mean, they're in the Big Ten for crying out loud, but, Michigan's down this year. Michigan State's a little bit down. But to me, the committee clearly was giving Indiana some love. A lot of people were like, Indiana's getting overlooked. And I'm like, I don't know that they are because they're 10-0, and yet the other unbeatens, I mean, BYU's 9-0, Army's unbeaten, and Army's behind LSU. I realize Oregon is number 1, but Oregon has a lot of things going for itself, including a huge win over Ohio State, who's 2nd. Ohio State's only losses to Oregon, and they may see each other again. We'll see. But Indiana, to me, by going 5th, what that means is the committee is saying, look, there are a lot of things that Indiana doesn't have on its resume, but they are all beyond Indiana's control. Indiana has done everything that they can control to be in this position, and they're 5th.
I don't know if this is tinfoil hat territory, but I'm going to put the hat on anyway, if Eddie Garrison is able to find it for me. Thank you, Eddie. I am very worried, and maybe it's because I'm not used to Indiana like most fans being in this position, but I'm very worried about what happens to them regardless of if they lose by 30 or if they lose by 3 to Ohio State. And it's not just brand bias to what happened to Florida State a year ago in a 14 playoff when they were undefeated. And it's not just the strength of schedule argument. It's what's happened to 2 teams who you can make a case are better or more exciting than Indiana. And it's Miami and Georgia. And they both suffered losses this past week, and they both tumbled in the rankings. I'm with you, Jake. The fact they're 5th in the ranking system right now is flowers and love being shown for Indiana and a level of respect for the committee. But if there's one thing we've seen now in this second ranking, when a loss comes at your doorstep, they're not afraid to make you tumble. They did it to Miami, and they did it to Georgia. for Indiana, if they lose to Ohio State in 2 weeks, and I know in their camp and even the most dominant of IU fans, they probably feel pretty confident about their chances against Ohio State. But if it's an L and they're now 10-1 going against Purdue, how far is the drop?
Right.
Because you can't tell me if Georgia beats Tennessee this week, they'll have another signature win underneath their belt, and they'll get back into the ranking system in some capacity. Are they going to drop Tennessee all the way out, and Indiana would hold on to their spot? Or are they reevaluating now? It all worries me because of all the things detractors of Indiana have said all year based on the other resumes these teams have.
So what's the tinfoiled hat theory then here, Jimmy?
That they're going to get usurped by a 2 or 3 loss SEC team.
So like Florida State last year?
Correct, yes.
Okay, explain this to me. Let me give you a schedule here. A loss to USC, Southern California. It was terrible. Well, I say that because there's another USC I'm about to mention. A win over Nicholls State. Congratulations. A win over South Carolina by a field goal. A win over UCLA. A win over South Alabama. A win in overtime over Ole Miss at home. A win over Arkansas. A substantial loss at Texas A&M. A blowout against Alabama at home. That's LSU's resume. And they're ranked?
That part I don't get. I don't know why we're still throwing flowers at the end. I think because it's so insignificant.
It's a great campus. It's a great stadium. Yeah. Their coach is a jackass. But I kind of like LSU. I've always kind of liked LSU.
I don't get
jackass.
It's the same thing with Louisville and South Carolina. Like if you're 15th or worse in this ranking system, as of right now, you're irrelevant to me. You're getting also ran votes.
Well, except for that some of those, and I don't think this is the case with LSU, some of those teams, though, that you talked about, still have a chance to get in via a conference championship.
Well, that's the part, right?
LSU, but what's LSU got going for itself?
That's not what I'm worried about with Indiana, though, because that's out of the committee's hands. If that happens, that's just taking advantage of an opportunity. And also for LSU, you would need a ton of chaos to ensue around you to get the auto bid. Like right now, it would be what? Texas and Tennessee, if the SEC title was today. I think that's right. So I get what you're saying, but like largely for most of those teams, they're not even in the conversation to win the auto bid from their conference. So
I want to see LSU, and they end the year with Oklahoma. Like I want to see those two teams go to a scoreless tie, just so that like both of them can still end up being ranked because of their name. Because Oklahoma's terrible too. They're terrible. The LSU thing, and then we haven't even discussed this because it's not really totally relevant within the market, but except for that they're now in the Big Ten. How big a disaster is USC? They gave Lincoln Riley. Have you ever been to, that song, Proud to be an Okie from Muskogee?
I don't know that one.
Okay.
Actually, I think I played it on the road trip to Idaho.
Well, the town Muskogee, the whole song, I think it's Waylon Jennings that does the song, or Merle Haggard, might be Merle Haggard. Anyway, whoever it is, they list all of the attributes of Muskogee, Oklahoma, and one of them that they fail to mention that is now true is it's actually owned by the University of Southern California, because USC bought everything in the state of Oklahoma in order to get Lincoln Riley as their head coach. They bought his house and paid it off. They gave a buyout to Oklahoma. I mean,
credit card debt was purged across the state. It was crazy.
Yes, dozens of millions of dollars to get him there, right?
Yeah.
They're terrible. They're terrible. 4-5, and they are, wait for it, 16th in the Big Ten.
Man. Wow. Purdue and USC together at last.
USC is the one program that loves Purdue. They're like, come on, Boilers. Stick around, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought the move to the Big Ten would have immediately bore fruit for both Oregon and USC.
Totally.
And the fact that USC hasn't met any of the expectations
Washington hasn't
for
been
them.
Great.
No.
Right?
Middle of the pack.
They beat USC.
And you had a coaching change, and you lost Penix. There was a ton of turnover there. You were never having those red flags about USC the way you could have about Washington.
If they lose to UCLA, USC can't lose. And UCLA's not any good, right?
The Bears are in need of an OC.
You're implying with Lincoln Riley to Chicago, you're
Yeah,
saying?
yeah, okay.
Caleb Williams reunion?
Well, you're right, because they've got a guy there that, yeah. I mean, it does make you wonder, right? And USC probably be happy for it.
Probably.
With the money that they're paying him.
Man, I remember when that high, and again, I know we won't, but when it happened, because I have friends out in California that are USC alums and big fans.
I think
and it
you mean Idaho, Jimmy.
I do. You're right.
That's right.
But like the thought was, they're back. It's Pete Carroll era
Did
again.
you meet them when you passed through California once?
I did. Yes. Right. As I was going through Utah as well.
Right.
It's all around. But like they thought it was. The Pete Carroll days were back.
I think
and
everybody
USC's
thought that,
return
right?
to glory, and it just
Did you see any mammoths?
Hasn't been there.
Or any Yetis?
Yetis are
no
cooler.
venom.
Yetis
no
are
venom
coolers,
either.
by the way. Jimmy, you got plays of the day?
Got a couple.
All right, including I will let you put the final line on the over-under for our big bet for tomorrow, right?
Sounds good.
We'll explain. do now. Because Muskoge's owned by the University of Southern California now. Part of the deal for getting the Lincoln Riley out of the entire state of Oklahoma. They paid everything in Oklahoma USC bought. It's a great song. Merle Haggard, by the way. It is time for Jimmy's plays of the day.
All NBA tonight for the plays of the day. I'll take the Houston Rockets to win outright over the Los Angeles Clippers. They welcome them to Houston tonight, tip-off at 8:10 p.m. The other game, of course, features the local talent in the Pacers, taking on the Orlando Magic on the road. I'll take the Pacers to win outright on that. That's basically a pick 'em at this stage. I'll also take Benedict Mathurin over 18.5 total points for the Indiana Pacers. Eddie, any plays from you tonight?
No good, sir.
Those are your plays of the day.
All right, the big one, though. Let's get to this. Did you decide a final line for my weight loss tonight? Because for those that are just joining the program.
Where have you been? Like, literally, where have you been?
And I encourage, listen.
We thank you for listening now, though.
I've had to do this before because I had diverticulitis. A colonoscopy is obviously not exactly the most fun thing or social thing to discuss, but it is important, and especially for men over the age of certainly 50, but probably starting at 40, to have it done. Mine is tomorrow, so I will not be here tomorrow, and that means that I'm doing the always fun prep work tonight.
Well,
so
I want the historical trend there then. You said you've had to do something similar before. Do you remember how much you lost then?
No, because I was like in my early 30s.
That's
I didn't care back then.
I'll set, because it was offered to me, even though I already have the bet out on 4.5, I will take 3.5 over under, and I will take the over there. So over, under 3.5 pounds loss for Jake Query. I'll go over.
Eddie, you're going to go with?
Under. I got to go under. We can't both be on the over here.
Okay. So I weighed myself this morning, and tomorrow, when I get out of the shower, before I go, I will weigh myself again, and we will have the total number at that point. As a matter of fact, you guys will know by the time you go on tomorrow.
Can you call in? We'll break it at some point.
That's right.
Hit the breaking news sounder.
Should I call in? Actually, the colonoscopy's at noon. You want me to call in like just as they're doing? You can't do that because
mid procedure.
Yeah,
I think Chick McGee had one on the air once. Didn't he?
He did. I think. Yeah, but
there's really nothing more that I'd want to think less about. There's somebody invading Chick McGee's space. You know.
You're a little.
As much as I like him, I do like him, but I don't want to think about anybody.
John, your thoughts on the news of the day?
My thoughts are that it needed to happen at some point. I don't know if there's any doubt about it. I'm surprised that this punishment, because this is what it was. It was a punishment of some sort here. This punishment was only 2 weeks long, and you're going to have a tough time selling that, everything has changed now. Why did you suspend him for 2 weeks? Why is 2 weeks enough? Because he showed up on time, consecutively for 2 weeks. But I always, here's the problem that you have. You don't want to root against the kid and that pick, even if you have an opinion the contrary, because it sets back this organization, if it's not right, even further. I mean, it's already how many years now since Luck? 5+ years since Luck. That's going to be even further. So this really does have to work. But, I've been pretty absolute about the fact that I don't think he's going to be the long-term solution here. And I go by what I've seen. And it has been a small sample size. But again, if you ask me right now, do I think that they're ever going to be in a position to want to give him an extension of any kind? What would you guys do right now? Would you go, oh, yeah, they're going to do it? Hell no, they're not going to do it. So you have to see something.
I certainly thought that the reality is this, John. The precedent is that if you have a guy that you draft high and you remove him and then reinsert him, it doesn't go well.
Well, they're following the Carolina Panthers playbook, which is always smart to follow.
Right.
They got a really good handbook there.
That's right. I mean, although
did win over the weekend.
Yeah. I guess Bryce Young has played better, right? I mean,
has he? Has he played better?
I mean, he looked, for where the bar was, he looked better over in London.
All right, so here's a hell of a question. Where's the bar for Richardson here? Because after all the feel good, because there's been this obvious divide between people wanting Flacco, people wanting Richardson. So
I stand by.
Where do you have to be?
I understand that from a box score analysis standpoint, it didn't show. He looked better in Houston than he had at any point this season. He had a lot of drops. The line plagued him. I want to continue to see him get better and better week by week and stay healthy. Those are my 2 bars. They're not big bars by any stretch, but it's the reality of where you're at.
Yeah, I think, again, it felt to me like the relationship was fractured, and whether or not I would say it was over, I don't know. I mean, I did say at the time, I was like, it's over, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they pulled him. It's the relationship felt over.
Well, I said at the very beginning, too, I said, if you yank somebody out like that, it's going to be over. And I'll maintain that. I do not think he's going to be the long-term future guy here, but he is back to try to prove himself now. And, they are doing what needs to be done. Let's face it. They are doing what needs to be
clearly,
done. They just have to do it in the typical Colts
they
clown
hit the
show
ceiling
fashion.
with Flacco, right? They hit the ceiling with Flacco. I mean, there was
I mean, that's so funny, though. The whole thing is so funny. Yeah, the ceiling, sure. Yep.
Well, it wasn't like Flacco was going to be able to do a Phillip Rivers for them.
His numbers were worse. His numbers were worse than Richardson through those 2 games.
Yeah. It just seems like that when they make a decision, it's more than likely not going to be the right one. So is this one going to be the right one?
Right.
It's the only decision you can make, but is it still going to be proven
you think
right?
Flacco, like if you're Joe Flacco, you think you're just like, you know what, I'm going to swing by, like, just hang out. I mean, you're over it at this point, right? If you're Flacco?
He said back in camp that he wasn't there
correct
to help and be a babysitter, and
it kind of looked that way,
he's
right?
Just being there.
It didn't necessarily look like the two of them
he was
were
very
sitting.
happy about the demotion. I thought that Anthony Richardson took the demotion much better than he did.
Even when Flacco was playing, you didn't see, and again, we don't see all of it, but like on the sideline standpoint, John, you didn't exactly see them like huddling together and going over stuff and talking. Ellinger the whole time kind of sits there, and he looks like the most awkward third wheel of all time half the time.
So what happens? Does Steichen, this all been Steichen? All this?
It puts the pressure back on Ballard, I think, because now
he has to have it. Ballard has to have Richardson come through here.
So
he needed that the entire
time.
Now
it's sink or swim, right?
No, I don't believe it's all been Steichen, to answer your question. I don't buy that it was just him.
Steichen talks to Jim, and then they develop a conclusion with Chris in the mix, too.
How about this? Who are the 2 people from a national standpoint you think Jim Irsay most cares about what they say and think about his franchise?
Talk about that today.
Jeff Saturday?
And? Probably McAfee, right?
Yeah,
McAfee.
Who are the 2 that have been the most outspoken for the last week about how this change needed to be made again?
Yeah. Well, and Saturday points the finger at Ballard, whereas I always disagreed with that because Ballard needs Richardson in this case, not Flacco, but Richardson. And McAfee just went all in on the organization.
Right.
Now, McAfee also had to walk back some of the things that he had said because both he and former Colts player Darius Butler, they all wanted to see Flacco. And then now they got to walk that back a little bit. So, actually, a lot. You got to walk that back.
But I'm saying, I do think that I think
yeah.
Irsay is very concerned about what those guys think of him.
There's no question. Yeah, and I think that gives you a window to the inside, right? It does, because I think they end up with information that others simply cannot get. That's why when I told everybody about the whole lateness and, this came from the Richardson side, wanting to see him be just a better professional. That was something that they recognized. So, obviously the Colts felt compelled to set him down and punish him for a couple of weeks.
John's up next.
Yes, Rick Venturi at 5 o'clock. That should be grand.
There you go. All right, Rick Venturi at 5 o'clock. Jimmy and Eddie be with you at noon tomorrow. I'll be back on Friday.
Are you going to get butthurt tomorrow?
I am. I'll let you know how it goes.
Jake's all butthurt.
That's exactly right. I will be.
Literally.
I certainly will be 24 hours from right now. You can bet on that.